Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? This ain't murder three. Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. I was going to tell you all about the great time I had in Edinburgh during the UFO event. I had my ticket to the site tour, where a UFO attacked a bunch of workers back in 1966, or maybe 67. I had a space to set up my table to sell books for the UFO festival, right next to the fountain. I had my ticket to the conference as well. Wednesday, I loaded up everything so I could get going Thursday without too many things to do. I did all the things needed to keep my dogs and cats happy until my wife got home, and then I fired up my truck and I headed southeast. I was driving my 2006 Honda Ridgeline, pulling a 20-foot KZ travel trailer. I had a bunch of podcasts downloaded to listen to as I went, so the trip wouldn't be quite so uninteresting. In Zapata, I had to stop at a light. The truck began running really bad. I had to put it in neutral and give it a little more gas to smooth things out. When the light turned green and I tried to go, the truck acted like it didn't want to. Lots of jerking around and, well, it felt wrong. I was thinking maybe I'd gotten some bad gas at the station. Once I got going out of town, things seemed to be going better, but as I would slow down due to other drivers or speed limits, it would act up again. I decided if things didn't improve by Roma, I was going to turn tail and head home. By Roma, I saw I was almost out of fuel. It's only 90 miles. I should have been able to make McAllen without any trouble. I pulled into a gas station and filled the tank. The engine didn't want to start. As I pulled out, it jumped around like an engine mount was broken, or maybe the flywheel had a crack or something crazy. The trip home was bad. As long as I was rolling, things were okay. It's when I slowed down or I stopped that life got interesting. I kept expecting to see my engine jump out from under the hood or a cloud of black smoke with flames. I dropped the trailer at my house and then I headed to the garage. Tony Aldape has kept me driving for a long time. TJ had someone pull my truck in and give it a once-over. I was running on 4 cylinders. The fuel injectors on 2 of the cylinders had stopped working. Electronic things that made them work had gone kaputski. I used to work on my own vehicles, back when the engine was something I could figure out. Today, it's a huge mystery with all the parts I used to know now missing. TJ gave me a ride home, and I am without wheels still today. I was disappointed that I missed the entire Edinburgh event. I was more upset that my truck is out of commission. I now have several boxes of books that I need to find a book fair to sell them. Otherwise, I'm going to have my own library with a very limited selection of reading material. Bill sent me a link to a YouTube video about a mysterious plane that landed with skeletons in the passenger compartment. September 4th, 1954. A Santiago Flight 513, a commercial airliner, departed from Aachen, Germany, heading to Porto Alegre in Brazil. It's about a 6,000-mile trip. The aircraft should have taken about 18 hours. Instead, it took about 35 years. The story was first carried in the Weekly World News in 1989. Brazilian aviation authorities confirmed a commercial aircraft, Santiago Flight 513, had taken off from West Germany September 4th, 1954. Its flight path was pretty much a straight line across the Atlantic Ocean. At the time, there was no way of tracking a mid-ocean flight. Somewhere during the trip, the plane vanished. It was assumed they had crashed, losing all lives aboard. October 12, 1989. The plane suddenly appeared on radar without any contact with air traffic control. 1 second, the screen was empty. Then there it was, coming in, a blip on the screen. Santiago Flight 513 was spotted circling the Porto Alegre airport, where it eventually made a successful landing. When the authorities approached the craft and took a look, they could see that the plane was kind of beat up looking. It didn't look like an airplane that should have been flying. They also noted that the airline, Santiago Airlines, had gone out of operation in 1956. When the door was finally opened, airport support and security were shocked when they discovered 92 skeletonized bodies, which included all 88 passengers and the 4 crew members sitting in their seats. The pilot, Captain Miguel Victor Correa, was sitting in the cockpit command position, still clutching the controls. The co-pilot was right next to him. The Brazilian government did investigate this strange occurrence. However, they refused to provide any explanations or theories of the missing flight. A paranormal researcher named Dr. Celso Atalio said that the Santiago Airline Flight 513 had undoubtedly entered a time warp. He didn't know how the skeleton of the pilot managed to land the plane safely. The government never came out with any proper explanation about the incident. They also refused to comment on Dr. Atalio's statement that the airplane had entered a time warp. It is strongly believed that the government officers have hushed up this case. Many people believe the story of Santiago Flight 513 is nothing but a hoax that now enjoys a spot in urban legend status. Anything unexplainable has to be a hoax. Some folks think the boys in the white lab coats can explain everything. Just ask them, how does gravity work? And they'll change the subject. Many theories were raised about what might have happened. It was also believed that the Brazilian government had cleared all the evidence that the time warp might exist, and they don't want to scare people. Was it a case of alien abduction? Had the plane emptied a wormhole or a portal? Were they victims of some supernatural phenomenon as they crossed the Bermuda Triangle? The strange case of Santiago Flight 513 continues to captivate researchers around the world. Is this story even possible? There are all kinds of weird things going on around us we are unaware of. The plane might have slipped through a portal and wound up in some other universe. It may have passed through there in a matter of hours or days and then jumped back into our world. As for all the skeletons, there may have been some kind of a time lag as they came back, causing the passengers and crew to advance quickly into old age as soon as the plane touched down. This is the only thing that would explain how a dead pilot and co-pilot could have landed the plane successfully. Everything appeared normal except for the long time lag until the plane had taxied to a stop. Perhaps the portal or the time lag that they were involved in hadn't snapped shut until the very last second. Now, this is not the only time something really bizarre has taken place when it comes to air travel. December 8th, 1942. An unidentified incoming plane was detected on radar flying aimlessly towards Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, from out over the Pacific Ocean, roughly from the direction of Japan. The radar blips seemed to come from nowhere. Attempts at radio contact were met with silence, and warplanes were scrambled to investigate this intruder. They thought that this might be a follow-up attack that had just happened a few days previously. When two warplanes approached the mystery plane, they discovered it was an American Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. The mystery aircraft seemed to have seen better days. Its body was perforated by numerous bullet holes, and the engine was sputtering and coughing noticeably. The two investigating pilots spotted someone at the controls of this mystery aircraft. The man at the controls looked bloody, and he was struggling to keep his plane in the air and pointed in a straight line. Where had it come from, and why was this out-of-date plane flying around out there? Nobody could answer any of these questions. The Warhawk was in service from 1938 until July 1942. It had seen a lot of dogfights in the skies over China. Ever wonder why a couple of planes battling it out in the sky are called a dogfight? During World War I, pilots discovered that by climbing sharply into the sky and then cutting off their engines, they could fall back behind their adversaries. This on and off of their engines reminded the soldiers on the ground of dogs growling in a fight. This led to the term dogfight. The military escorts paced the plane for a while, baffled as to where it had come from and wondering what to do. There were no records of any P-40s flying out of Pearl Harbor. No one knew where the plane had come from. The pilot of the mystery plane looked at his two escorts, smiled and waved, and then the plane made a sharp banking turn towards the ground. The P-40 hit the ground and exploded. A recovery team was sent out to deal with the mess. When the wreckage was examined, there was no sign of the pilot. There was no sign of anyone ever having been with the plane. And the only clue they could find was a diary in which was written that the plane had flown from the island of Mindanao, 1,300 miles away. The P-40 Warhawk had a maximum range of 1,400 miles. It was also found that the landing gear was missing, apparently completely blown off in battle, and the plane had likely been in no condition to fly very far in the first place, let alone 1,300 miles. Where had it come from, and Where had it been? How had it managed to operate in such a dire condition? Who was the mysterious pilot that the American fighter pilots insisted they saw? These were questions with no answers. The commanding officer of the Flying Tigers, Claire L. Chenault, was a retired captain from the Army Air Corps who was working in China as an advisor to the Chinese Air Force when the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1937. Chiang Kai-shek hired Chenault to lead the training of the Chinese fighter pilots. The first American volunteer group was a unit of Chinese Air Force, a unit of the Chinese Air Force, serving in Burma and China from December 1941 until 1942, when it was replaced by the 23rd Fighter Group. You've seen those fighter planes with the shark's teeth painted under the propeller. Those were the Flying Tigers. Why did the Flying Tigers have a shark's mouth? Japanese pilots were supposed to be afraid of sharks. Why the unit wasn't called the Flying Sharks is because the folks in Washington didn't know about the artwork on the airplanes. When coming up with a name, they went with Tigers since they were native to the area. Needing fighter planes and fast, China had bought or borrowed planes for anybody with aircraft. Many came from the U.S. or Russia. Lured by the promise of high pay and steady work, 99 pilots and 184 support troops sailed to Burma. They all had to resign from the U.S. Army or the Navy, since the U.S. was still not at war. Today, Burma is called Myanmar. The question, still unanswered, is how did a P-40 Warhawk manage to fly across the Pacific Ocean and wind up crashing in Hawaii? What happened to the pilot? Even though the plane blew up, there should have been plenty of human remains found, but all they had was the plane. November 23, 1944, a British Royal Air Force anti-aircraft unit stationed near Kottenburg, Belgium, spotted an incoming airplane. They examined it closely to see if they needed to shoot at it or lend a hand getting the plane to where it needed to go. What they saw flying towards them was a B-17 Flying Fortress. The name was given to these planes because they were so heavily armed. There were as many as 13 50-caliber machine guns aimed in all directions, making it difficult to approach from any direction without being shot at. The plane was coming in fast with the landing gear down. There was no such thing as air-to-ground communication. They used different radios, and it looked as if the plane was going to make an emergency landing. This was a small group of soldiers stationed here to fire on German aircraft. The closest thing to a landing strip was a plowed field in front of their position. The soldiers manning the anti-aircraft guns were surprised because there hadn't been any flights of bombers over their location that day. A call back to base let them know that this plane was on its own. It was going to land, and it was now their job to help out any way they could. The bomber hit the ground and ran out the end of the field. It lost speed as it came, and it finally stopped just short of the gun emplacements. The British soldiers all ran to the aid of the American crew. Any time a bomber was flying on its own, it was a huge target for German fighters. Fighters were given points for each plane they shot down. An enemy fighter was worth 1 point. A bomber was worth 4. The more points you got, the quicker you could receive the Iron Cross. As the Brits were running up to the bomber, they expected to see the crew in all manner of injury. The engines kept running, and there was no sign of any crewman movement inside. A B-17 carried a lot of fuel, and they could explode if things were messed up. Plus, if the plane had turned for home before dropping its load of bombs, there might still be explosives on board. These bombs were not all that stable at the best of times. A really bad landing could trigger one or all of them. The Brits waited for as long as they could, and then they decided to enter and see just how bad things were. The quickest and easiest way in was the two side gunners' positions. There was no one there. Once inside, the British soldiers searched the whole plane. It was devoid of any crewmen. There were plenty of indications the crew had been on board, things left behind as well as things missing. There were parachutes still in the racks waiting to be used. All the machine guns were missing as well as the ammo. There were a few coats hung from hooks on the walls, and they found some snacks scattered about. The B-17 became known as the Phantom Fortress. Inquiries were made, and soon the missing crew was found. Their story didn't explain the Phantom Fortress at all. The bomber had been heading into Germany. It received some damage to one of the engines, and it was unable to keep up with the flight, so the pilot was ordered to return to base. As they were trying for the coast, the captain ordered the crew to lighten their load. Anything not needed to keep the plane in the air was thrown out. Machine guns, bullets, anything not tied down went out the door. The full load of bombs were stuck in their racks due to a malfunctioning delivery system. They didn't have Major Kong to try fixing things. Now, that was a cool movie, Dr. Strangelove. If you haven't seen it, you should. A second engine gave out, and the pilot announced it was time to bail out. The crew all jumped, and surprisingly, they all managed to survive. The German army was being pushed back, and so the crew were picked up by friendlies. Their stories didn't answer any of the questions. The British soldiers all said the fortress was coming in with all 4 engines going. The crew said they had lost 2 engines. All the crewmen bailed out using their parachutes. The Brits found parachutes in the plane. There was no such thing as a backup. You got one chute, and that was it. Also, it was standard procedure to wear your parachute anytime you were inland from the coast. It was on top of your life vest, which were also SOP. It was cold up there in the clouds. Why would anyone of the crew take off their jacket while in flight? To begin with, it was well below freezing. They would need to remove their parachute, then their life vest, unzip their coat in a very cold plane, then put their life vest back on and the parachute back on top of that, which now would be very loose without that great big fur-lined leather coat under it. The straps would all have to be readjusted before jumping. The anti-aircraft personnel all knew what damage looked like. There would be bullet holes and huge chunks missing from the anti-aircraft fire. The hull of the bomber should have looked like a bit of Swiss cheese. They all said the plane looked like it could have flown back to England except for some damage to the wing from its emergency landing. The crew said they had received anti-aircraft flak as well as machine gun fire as they were flying over Germany. Pilots will tell you, flying is easy, landing is hard. How on earth did a B-17 manage to land all by itself is still open to debate. While in flight, trying to keep the plane in the air, the pilot and co-pilot would not have lowered the landing gear because that would have put more drag on the plane, slowing it down even more. The wheels were in the upright position when the pilot and co-pilot both bailed out. Yet, when the B-17 was approaching the anti-aircraft position, the wheels were down. The records all agree that the plane did land by itself. The damage was minimal once on the ground, yet sufficient to make the crew jump. Folks don't jump from a bomber that can still fly. These planes were not designed for parachutists. There was a very real chance of being killed jumping from any one of the positions. Just go online and look at damaged B-17 aircraft that managed to stay in the air. These were some tough old birds. Even though there were lots of bombers used in World War II, the B-17 is what most folks think of when they think of bombers. During the war, hundreds of Allied aircraft were sent to bomb German sites. Many never made it back. There are dozens of reports of ground crews waiting and watching for the flight to return. There was no such thing as air-to-ground communication. A radio being used at an air base was a target for German aircraft. Directional antenna would have given the enemy a location to launch against. If a plane needed medical assistance, they would fire red flares to let the ground crew know which planes needed the medics. In order to determine how many planes were lost, the tower would count as they landed. The number would be checked against how many had launched. Over the next few hours, reports might come in of planes or two landing at one of the emergency landing fields. In 1943, Woodbridge was constructed in the southeast as one of 3 airfields set up to accept distressed aircraft returning from raids over Germany, and it was fitted with an extra long, extra heavy-duty runway. You should recognize the name from the twin airfields, Bentwater and Woodbridge airfields, from the Rendlesham UFO incident. Reports would also come in from farmers who would now have a B-17 parked in one of their fields. August 17, 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force, the main American unit of heavy bombers stationed in England, launched 376 B-17 bombers against Schweinfurt and Regensburg in Germany. 60 of these bombers were shot down. That's 1 out of every 6 planes. The ground crews knew the men flying these planes. They ate together in the chow hall. They shared stories of home. They hung out on the few hours of rest. It was common to have a plane or several missing at the end of the day. Suddenly, the sound of engines would be heard coming from the east. The ground crew would turn, watching to see which of the missing had made it. On occasion, they would see a speck on the horizon, slowly growing bigger. They would watch and wait for this plane to arrive. This was impossible. The plane should have run out of gas a long time ago. The bomber would be there, and then it was gone. The ground crew knew they had heard and seen one of the missing planes coming in for a landing. All they could say was this must have been a ghost plane shot down somewhere over Europe. For years after the war was over, people would hear and sometimes see B-17 bombers flying overhead, passing from the east, heading west towards some long-abandoned airfield. There's a ghostly plane that haunted the skies of northern Italy during the war. It would rain destruction upon the countryside, and it came to be known as Pippo. Pippo was said to appear only at night, always alone, and it would most often perform punishing strafing runs on seemingly indiscriminate targets, either firing with its machine guns or dropping bombs. Sometimes it was said to deploy rather bizarre ordnance, such as exploding pens, or incendiary flares, or sometimes poison candy. It was known to drop something called a butterfly bomb, which was actually a German anti-personnel device used by the Luftwaffe. A butterfly bomb, or spring bomb Dickwangen, it was a 2 kilogram, or SD2, was a German anti-personnel submunition used by the Luftwaffe during the Second World War. It was so named because the thin cylindrical metal outer shell, which hinged open when the bomblet deployed, gave it the superficial appearance of a large butterfly. This mystery plane seemed to have no rhyme or reason as to who it chose to target. It would attack both Allied and Axis troops. It fired on civilian targets, and it dropped those small bombs in places not considered to be a tactical location. Out-of-the-way farms and fields, as well as villages well outside of the battle zone. No one ever actually saw the night-flying aircraft, but everybody heard the weird sound it made. The engine made a kind of a pip-pip-pip sound instead of the usual drone of a military power plant. The sound is what caused folks to refer to it as Pippo. Since it only flew in the dark and always alone, there was no way of guessing when or where it might attack next. The terrified people feared the plane, and they would retreat into their homes at the first inkling of the strange, unsettling pipping sound it made. Being called Pippo, it sounds more like a cartoon character than a feared killer. Kind of like the shark in Jaws that was actually named Bruce. Once inside the perceived safety of their homes, everyone would close all the curtains and put out any lights. They hoped and prayed the mystery aircraft would pass them by. By morning, it was time to venture outside and see what kind of damage had been done. On a few occasions, Pippo would pass over a home, firing its machine guns or dropping bombs, when without any indication, the plane would vanish. The pipping sound would stop and the bullets would cease to fly about. At other times, it would pass back and forth over a town or a farm, firing thousands of rounds and dropping hundreds of bombs. Many a home was reduced to nothing by this mystery plane. Those who still followed Mussolini and his fascist government all blamed the U.S. or the British military. Those who considered Il Duce to be a bad idea said it was the Nazis or the Italian army trying to sow fear in the people who wanted a change in their leadership. Most of the terrified people began to say there was no pilot controlling the aircraft, or it was being piloted by the devil himself or one of his demons. With all the destruction caused by the war, it is near impossible to figure out what was caused by either side or what was destroyed by Pippo. On more than one occasion, in fact it was quite common, a flight would be sent out only to attack a friendly town or a village. One air wing bombed the same U.S. Army battalion 3 times in 3 different locations. There are scarce records of this phenomenon in the official aviation literature. Accounts of Pippo are known of mostly through oral tradition, letters, diaries, and newspaper reports. But as phenomenal as the idea of a spectral plane flying solo missions over the Italian countryside may sound, it has been mostly agreed upon that the stories have some grain of truth in them and were likely based on an actual aircraft. It is not clear just what its origins could have been. One possibility was that it was the Italian government orchestrating a propaganda campaign against the Allies or some kind of psychological warfare by having one of their own planes attack its own citizens and then blame it on the enemy to turn public opinion against them. Others say it was some loose cannon pilot waging a personal vigilante war against his enemies, perhaps on some unknown vendetta. There's also the possibility the plane could have been one of the many tactical night missions launched by the Allies in the aftermath of gaining the upper hand in Italy. There were some wild and outside-the-box ideas used during the war. In 1942, Russia began using the Night Witches. These were 1920s aircraft piloted by women who would fly only at night. They would shut off their engines and glide over Nazi troops, dropping bombs from soundless sky. The German Luftwaffe would send out single fighters that would fly along at night looking for any targets of opportunity. The U.S. began referring to them as Bed Check Charlie. There are records of who these pilots were and when and where they flew from. Any plane in the sky has to have a support system. There have to be mechanics to keep the engine running. There have to be people putting gasoline in the wings. There has to be somebody loading more ammo once the plane is empty. These attacks were normal as anything happening in wartime, but the plane's behavior in traditional aircraft manners. The bullets did what bullets could do. Bombs blew up. Pippo was credited with attacking with machine guns blazing, making too many passes to be any kind of a normal aircraft. Fighter planes can only carry so much ammo. A few thousand pounds of bullets would only last about 30 seconds while being fired. 4 or 6 machine guns could burn through ammo pretty fast. A Pippo would pass over the same target several times, firing for minutes instead of seconds. The attack from Pippo went on for months as the Allies tried pushing through Italy. It wasn't until Mussolini was executed by his own people and the fighting moved into Germany that reports of this mystery aircraft ended. With tons of records destroyed either in bombing raids or by retreating troops, it's nearly impossible to figure out how many people or homes were destroyed by Pippo. No one ever came forward saying they knew who was piloting the aircraft, where it flew from, or what happened to it after the war. To this day, all manner of unexploded bombs and crashed planes have been found all over Europe. England has the same problem. They've found V-2 rockets while digging subway tunnels. On occasion, folks have seen unexplainable aircraft flying overhead as well. In April 1995, while walking his dog over the moors, a retired postman suddenly noticed a shadow fall over him. He looked up to see a huge 1940s plane about 55 feet above him. He could see the propellers were running, yet he couldn't hear any sound from the aircraft. He watched the plane turn and then take a downwards position, and he witnessed it crash over a tall hedge in a nearby field. He ran to the location, but when he arrived, there was no wreckage to be found. Meanwhile, his dog had refused to enter the field with him, and for days after the incident would not go near the spot where the crash had taken place. Shortly after 10 p.m. on March 24, 1997, multiple people reported a small plane flying low to the ground which crashed and exploded somewhere on or near the Howden Moors. When rescue crews arrived, there was no sign of any crash. The emergency services, under the coordination of South Yorkshire Police, searched an area 50 square miles over 15 hours. This was the largest ever air and ground response to an aircraft crash, with hundreds of personnel involved. Yet, no wreckage was found. Shortly after, it was declared that no plane or any other object had crashed. Given the number of witnesses who had all seen the crash and the dramatic number of search teams out looking for what sounded like a small aircraft, many began to suspect a cover-up. Over the following hours and even into the next day, further reports came of seeing military jets in the area around the same time as the crash. The RAF would put a dangerous fly zone in place over the site with a 10-mile radius. This would result in planes arriving at Manchester Airport having to stack up at increasingly higher altitudes until these restrictions were lifted. The reason given for the restrictions was to allow search helicopters to conduct a search of the area without having to worry about other aircraft. To some, that appeared excessive and appeared more in the lines of recovering material and wreckage in a clandestine manner. The official report says there was no aircraft crash and there was nothing to see here. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. The people who witnessed the crash say it was either some kind of a UFO or a ghost plane, a scene that may have crashed during the war. In late March 2018, almost 11 years to the date of the Howden Moor incident, dozens of reports came in regarding old World War II planes flying over the skies of Derbyshire. The wave of initial sightings came in on March 26th between 6 and 7 p.m., and were reported to the local newspapers the following day. The military claimed that the sightings were nothing more than a Hercules C-130 military plane on training exercises. Many of the reports, however, are full of details, and they are strikingly similar. Why am I having trouble with that word? Similar. I'm making up words as I go. A C-130 is a very distinct-looking aircraft. It kind of looks like a bumblebee. World War II aircraft did not look like C-130s. There was nothing in the sky back then that could even be sort of mistaken for that kind of an aircraft. While there may have been some reports of a Hercules military transport plane, others are distinctly that of a Douglas Dakota, a transport plane utilized regularly by the Army during World War II. Perhaps more interestingly, many of the reports would include the strange detail of the entire sky turning eerily dark as the mystery craft went overhead. Many also mention a distinct lack of sound despite how low the plane were. If you've ever been near a C-130, those things make a lot of noise. Several accounts would also state that one of the planes appeared about to crash, while another was following. It looked as if it was trying to chase the first one. Following the publication of the story, a flood of reports would come in from the public to the local papers. One resident wrote on the paper's social media page that he was on the A-38 with his father at about 6:45 p.m. He said 2 aircraft flew over us. It was scary. They were so low. They made no sound and they produced no visible trails behind them. Another resident claimed the planes went over her house in nearby Belpaire. She said they were very low, they were very huge, and they were quiet. As well as the lack of sound, many would report that the planes were banking and a second plane was giving chase. The statement from the military that they had deployed a Hercules transport plane over the skies of Derbyshire on the evening in question might not be untrue, but then again, that might not be what's actually going on. They could simply say, oh yeah, there was a C-130 in the sky that day, because there might have been a C-130 in the sky every day. It doesn't mean that's what people were seeing. Some witnesses would claim to be able to hear one plane while the other one was completely silent. Others claimed that a second plane appeared to be giving chase. Might it be that the military scrambled its own planes in response to the sightings of the Phantom plane? And if so, what would be the reason for this? We need you to go out and chase that ghost plane that's flying through the sky. This next story might be a bunch of hooey. Then again, strange things have happened all the time, and those in charge will never fess up to what is going on around us. The writer went with the idea that this plane belonged to Flight 19, but the names don't line up. April 2022, one of a group of 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers that disappeared over the Bermuda Triangle on December 5, 1945, better known as Flight 19, mysteriously reappeared at Patrick Air Force Base in Brevard, Florida. Flight 19 had launched from Fort Lauderdale, 150 miles south of Patrick. Around 7:15 a.m., a single-engine propeller aircraft arrived in the vicinity of the United States Air Force Restricted Flight Zone, and they were using an abandoned military radio frequency to request permission to land. The pilots ignored several warnings from the tower operators insisting that his obsolete aircraft was a military vehicle belonging to the U.S. Air Force. He said he was low on fuel and he needed to land immediately. The craft was finally escorted to the airfield by 2 F-14 jet fighters, and it landed on the airfield under close scrutiny. The base's security staff was surprised to see 2 disoriented old men wearing World War II uniforms come out of the cockpit, visibly confused. According to the U.S. Air Force spokesman, Colonel James Miller, the 2 men claimed to have disappeared in 1945, and they had no memory of what happened to them over the last 75 years. They asked us if the war with Japan was over and who had won. These old guys seemed visibly confused. Japan had surrendered September 2, 1945, and Flight 19 took off December 5th, 94 days later. Colonel Miller said the men's fingerprints and teeth seemed to match the military records of men they claimed to be, Lieutenant James Monroe and Captain David Smith, but they seemed to be too young to be these 2 men. They looked to be around 65 years old when they should be over 110. It's as if they had gotten lost in a type of warp zone where time is slowed. Both men were scheduled to undergo a thorough medical examination and interrogation to try to determine the veracity of their story and what may have happened to them. Colonel Miller says the aircraft is authentic and the crew's story seems legitimate, but the U.S. Air Force will open an investigation to try to determine what really happened to them and their lost comrades in 1945. The aircraft was authentic as one of 5 planes part of Flight 19, which disappeared over Bermuda Triangle December 1945. Flight 19 was taking part in a routine navigation and combat training exercise in TBM-type aircraft when they lost radio contact and disappeared. None of these planes were ever found, and another aircraft even disappeared while searching for them. Unfortunately, the 2 men seem to have no memory of what happened to them during their ordeal, so the mystery remains totally concerning the fate of the other aircraft. The list of missing airmen from Flight 19 does not include a Monroe or a Smith. However, Flight 19 was not the only aircraft missing from Florida during World War II. A lot of planes crashed while doing training. The coast of Florida is littered with planes that were not connected to Flight 19. This is right up there with the Mary Celeste being connected to the Bermuda Triangle. The Mary Celeste was sailing from New York to Italy. They would have to have made a huge swing south to have vanished in the Bermuda Triangle, yet a lot of folks will connect the two. A TBM Avenger bomber missing or found in Florida doesn't have to be connected to Flight 19. This could be just as big a mystery without being connected to Lieutenant Taylor and his missing men. I don't fly anymore. I've been over my run-in with the TSA. When you choose to get on board a plane and you put your fate in the hands of the ground crew, hoping they put all the screws back in before putting the plane on the runway, or the flight crew, all are having a good day, you just might want to think about this next story. August 14th, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 was scheduled to fly from Larnaca, Cyprus to Prague in the Czech Republic, with a stopover in Athens, Greece. At 9 a.m., the plane took off from Larnaca with 115 passengers on board and a crew of 6 for what was to be just a short flight over to their stopover in Athens. It was a short flight with an experienced captain with 35-year veteran pilot Hans-Jürgen Merten. Everything was going fine as the aircraft headed north-northwest. Shortly before the plane entered Greek airspace, there was an eerie transmission received from the flight by the Helios Operations Center on the ground. The captain said, "The takeoff configuration warning light is on. Cooling equipment normal and the alternate is offline. The ventilation cooling fan lights are off. Where are my equipment cooling circuit breakers?" When the engineer on the ground asked, "Can you confirm that the pressurization panel is set to auto?" there was no response and all communication was then lost. The plane kept flying normally as if nothing had happened. As it entered Greek airspace without any further word, the flight was declared to be a renegade. They could see where the plane was, but they could not communicate with it. It was only getting stranger from there. Once communications were lost, Flight 522 was just silently flying along its flight path. The operations room was in crisis mode. Planes don't just lose communications and continue flying. Things can go wrong. The normal thing to do was to turn back for their departure airport. Flying into other countries' airspace could be dangerous, since fighter planes just might consider them to be an enemy target. The operations began contacting the military, telling them that the plane was civilian, but it was not responding on the radio. Aircraft entered the holding pattern for Athens Airport and began circling around as if it was preparing to land. All of the numerous attempts to establish radio contact were met with silence. 2 F-16 fighter aircraft from Hellenic Air Force 111 Combat Wing were scrambled from the Nia Anchilos Air Base and sent to intercept and investigate this renegade plane, as it was now being feared that a terrorist attack was taking place. The jets approached Flight 522 at about 11 o'clock, and they began circling around, trying to get a view within the passenger plane. In the cockpit, the captain's chair was empty, and the co-pilot was slumped over in his seat, motionless. In the passenger cabin, it could be seen that the oxygen masks had been deployed, but were not being used. They were merely dangling freely, and 3 passengers could be seen sitting motionless, as if frozen. As the F-16s continued their appraisal of the situation, an unidentified flight attendant could be seen entering the cockpit, sitting in the captain's chair, and begin struggling to control the plane. This flight attendant would later be identified as Andreas Prodromou, who held a UK commercial pilot's license but was in no way qualified to fly a Boeing 737. An unidentified woman, later found to be his girlfriend, Haris Charlamboas, also entered the cockpit, seemingly trying to help him control the plane. It was still unclear where the captain was or why these two were moving about while everybody else on board seemed to be slumped over and unresponsive. Prodromous would wave at the F-16s just before one of the engines on the plane burned out. A smoke began coming from the plane, and it began to descend. Flight 22 crashed into the hills of Grammatiko, about 25 miles from Athens, setting ablaze a huge swath of land. There were no ground casualties, but everyone on board was either killed in the crash or dead before it came down. The rescue teams dispatched to the site became recovery teams instead. When the wreckage was sifted through, it was found that most of the bodies of the victims had been frozen before crashing. They were still strapped in their seats, with the oxygen masks dangling right in front of them, but never used. An investigation was immediately launched, and it was soon found that the plane had been experiencing some unusual problems before it touched down in Larnaca. It would come to light that the crew arriving from London had reported that the door seal was frozen, as well as some strange and anomalous noises heard from the right aft service door. A pressurization leak check had been carried out while in Cyprus. The system had been switched to manual for the upcoming flight. The same plane had experienced pressurization problems before, and there had been numerous complaints about the aircraft often getting cold or having air conditioning problems. The main idea at the time was there had been a catastrophic pressurization malfunction due to the system not being set to auto during the maintenance check, even after various checks during the pre-flight procedure, the after-start check, and the after-takeoff checks. This would have resulted in a slow depressurization of the entire aircraft as it climbed to cruising altitude, with most people not even aware that it was happening other than an uncomfortable sensation in their ears. The results would have been devastating. A dwindling oxygen supply would have crept up on them to totally immobilize everyone involved. If it had been set back to auto mode, the pressurization system would have automatically pressurized the captain at higher altitude. But in this case, it had failed to do so, and the pilots are thought to have overlooked this fact due to slowly losing their cognitive functions due to a lack of oxygen. The pressure in the plane had become abnormally low, and this caused everyone to lose consciousness before they even had a chance to use their oxygen masks. A warning would have sounded at this point, but it is thought that the pilot had mistaken it for a takeoff configuration warning, which signals that the aircraft is not ready for takeoff and can only sound while the plane is on the ground. It is still not clear why the captain would have left his post, but it seems there was some amount of confusion going on while the plane was in the air. A sudden decompressurization at 30,000 feet and above can plunge temperatures inside the cabin to below 0 degrees, which would have further incapacitated passengers and crew. The captain had at some point turned on the autopilot, which had taken the plane along its planned course even as those aboard lost consciousness. As for Andres Prondramo and his girlfriend, it was thought that they had only managed to avoid this fate because they had been carrying personal oxygen supplies and had been able to buy themselves some more time before commandeering the plane and losing control of it as it ran out of fuel. During a crisis on an airplane, the flight attendants each have a bottle of oxygen on a strap and a face mask that they can put on while they walk up and down the aisles helping other people with those funny-looking little plastic cups that are supposed to supply oxygen in a crisis. Yes, this is one more reason I don't fly anymore. Several of the people involved with the airline were found guilty of negligence and manslaughter, but they were let off with a stiff fine. In the press, this was all being reported as a mysterious ghost plane, and it ramped up a lot of attention at the time. Indeed, it all hasn't been completely explained to everyone's satisfaction. There are even theories that this wasn't an accident, but rather the result of the airplane being haunted. In the end, there are still many mysteries to it all. And at the very least, the Helios Flight 522 ghost plane has remained a very airy aviation mystery that has continued to be picked apart and debated to this day. Nope, I'm not going to fly ever again. Too many people out there who think that's not my job to keep a plane in the air to my liking. I did some work at the Houston airport during a early part of a war that we had in the Middle East. I was there as security with the Border Patrol. And one of the things we had to do was go on board the plane and look around to make sure nobody left anything dangerous behind. When the ground crew is working on an airplane, they have this great big red painted piece of plywood with red streamers that hang off of it that they place on the dashboard of the pilot's area. This red thing is not supposed to be on the plane if the plane is going to fly. If the pilot walks in and he finds this great big red thing sitting on the dash, it means that the plane is not to be flown. We would find these security items hidden away in some of the overhead compartments near the pilot's cabin. Apparently, they were being ignored all the time. If you enjoyed the show, I did my job once again. Let me know if there's something you want to hear about. You can contact me at strangethings@arcanasa.com. Now, I listen to a lot of other podcasts, and I don't want to compare myself to them, and I don't try to mimic what other people are doing. I was listening to this one podcast. It was really cool. It had a really, really creepy vibe to it. And it was about 2/3 of the way through the story that they were telling when suddenly they announced if I wanted to hear the last third of the show, I had to join. I had to become a member to listen to the whole show. Well, that's a little annoying. Well, I listened to another show and the same thing happened. They were 2/3 through the story when they announced that if I wanted to know how the story was going to end, I had to pay to hear it. Well, I simply unsubscribed from that podcast. I don't think that that's the way to do it. Now, if you would like to support me, if you've got a few extra bucks that you just want to throw away on my account, buy one of my books. You can go to Amazon.com, get a copy of Paranormal Laredo, and if later you decide you don't want to read it, you can give it to somebody else as a Christmas or a birthday gift. Or you can go to TeePublic and buy a t-shirt or coffee cup, and I'll get a few bucks to help with the show. If not, just keep listening for free. I hope you enjoy the show. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?